The US government is trying to change table saws forever, but not without a little pushback from the major manufacturers here. In this video, I'm going to share with you some actual responses to the government from major brands, including DeWALT or Stanley Black & Decker, who makes DeWALT and Craftsman, Harbor Freight, Grizzly, Bosch, as well as some others. Let's go. If you missed the last video on this topic, I'm going to give you the short version and let you watch the rest of it after this video. Essentially what is happening is the US government is trying to make it a mandatory rule that all table saws have active injury mitigation technology. In other words, SawStop-like, or if you saw the Altenorf video, similar to that style technology that'll prevent accidents or cuts from the table saw. It sounds like a good thing, except for the fact there's a few things to take into consideration. Number one, cost. It's going to raise the cost of all table saws from budget all the way up to high-end table saws significantly. And two, there's really only one player in the game that has this technology that's licensable at a reasonable fee. And that's where it's really getting nasty. Let me show you these responses. First off, who's making these rules? Who's mandating this stuff? Well, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or CPSC as I'll call them from now on. If you see the warning label like on buckets and things like that, that's kind of the more famous one. Similar to that, they make these rules where things have to have warnings as well as equipment, such as your riving knife, things like that. Basically, their job is to protect the public from unreasonable risk of serious injury or death from thousands of types of consumer products under its jurisdiction, and table saws fall under that. So in my previous video, the commission had stated that it would likely be that SawStop or another company would have the technology that others would license from them, and it would give them a benefit for a few years until their patents expire and they were coming soon. Well, that's not true according to some of these responses. Let's get into it. Now there's a few terms you need to be familiar with moving through these responses so you understand what the meaning of them or these acronyms are. First, AIM or AIM-T is active injury mitigation technology. In other words, it's going to stop the blade from spinning should it contact your skin. Next is you're going to hear FRAND license a lot, F-R-A-N-D, which means a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licensing commitment to the manufacturers. Fair, reasonable, very key terms there. All right, Stanley Black & Decker owns DeWALT and Irwin and Porter Cable and Craftsman, but really, as far as I know, DeWALT and Craftsman may be the only two table saws that they're manufacturing. Their response to the commission about this new technology or about this new rule is quite interesting. In their letter to the commission, this is a huge thing that I didn't see anywhere else up until this point. It says SawStop maintains numerous unexpired patents directed to AIM technology that are potential SEPs, which is basically standard essential patents. For instance, as noted by the CEO of TTS, who owns SawStop, TTS does, the US patent number 9724840 is an unexpired patent with claims directed to an actuator that causes the blade to stop cutting the person within 10 milliseconds, in quotes, and will not expire until April 8th, 2033. That's 9 more years, or 9 and a few months from this year. So if that patent is still there until 2033, and that is an essential patent that goes into the AIM technology, that means that SawStop has that patent and controls any licensing of that patent until 2033. So they would literally have a monopoly on this whole thing until 2033 if the commission forces table saw companies to license a technology or build their own technology. Really, there's only one option, and that's to license that technology, and we'll get into why later. And it goes on in his response to say that as a result, manufacturers may be prohibited from making or selling table saws with AIM technology for the next 10 years, 9 now, unless they obtain a license from SawStop. If the CPSC intends to facilitate the sale and production of table saws with AIM-T, requiring SawStop to offer a FRAND license to all manufacturers is crucial. FRAND, fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory. They go on to say that with such a commitment that SawStop and TTS cannot withhold a license from any party seeking in good faith to implement the standard the CPSC enacts. In other words, if this comes to play, then SawStop shouldn't be allowed to withhold those licenses. So why would they use the word withhold there? Withhold that license? Well, it's because it's happened. They've withheld this license, or companies have tried to license this technology in not so distant past from SawStop, and they've denied the request. So they need to know that if they enact this, And SawStop's the one that's got the license and patents on this stuff, or the patents, that these companies are going to be able to actually license it at a fair and reasonable cost. Here's the fear, right? Because here's what you say. By contrast, the lack of a FRAND commitment risks royalties being set unreasonably high. Remember, FRAND is fair and reasonable. Significantly increasing the price of table saws, reducing product availability, and increasing the risk that consumers will use older saws or turn to alternative, less safe solutions. And this was brought up a bunch in the comments on that last video, that if people can't purchase a table saw at a reasonable price, they'll just DIY their own, which is going to be disastrous. Like, it'll just be a lot more injuries. So the actual reason behind this, you're making this saw safer by law, but then people go around it and do other things, which makes injuries still there. They also bring up the fact that if there is no FRAND commitment, it also could lead to more injunctions by SawStop or TTS to prevent the sale of competing AIM technology equipped table saws, which they've been very vigorous in defending their patents, which they're legally allowed to do, and you should defend your patents. That's just kind of the way the patent system works. If you don't defend it, then it's not really any good. And then they kind of, in my opinion, this is my opinion, not legal advice, but in my opinion, they throw a little shade here at SawStop when he says the adoption of AMT as a mandatory standard would likely be neither timely nor widespread. Indeed, as a self-proclaimed, this is a shade, #1 cabinet saw in North America, SawStop and its parent have an incentive to reduce the sales of competing goods, raise rivals' costs, delay implementation, and exclude the competition. So basically saying that they really don't want this on their saws unless they're getting paid a good royalty on it. So, and in contrast, a FRAND commitment would substantially increase the likelihood that the AMT is implemented widely, quickly, and at a reasonable royalty. Sum this up is the fact that if they don't have that fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory clause in there that makes everything reasonably priced, then if they don't do that, then it's going to really price out the competition. But if they do that, then they will actually help this come to fruition faster. Now, in this response, we got a little bit of a peek behind the curtain here, because according to Stanley Black & Decker's response, it says that SawStop has continuously refused multiple AMT licensing requests dating back to 2002 by Grizzly, another table saw manufacturer. Later, Stanley, Bosch, and Ryobi each approached SawStop to license AIM technology in 2009, but were refused a license because SawStop, quote, feared that it would lose sales of its AMT saws. They say that there's no reason to believe that AMT patent holders would agree to license all or perhaps any competing firms. Without the agreement, they might just say, no, go kick rocks, I'm not licensing you anything. And then that's going to force them out of business if they can't put it on there and they can't come up with their own solution, which Bosch talks about in just a minute, how long it would take to implement one of them. It's a massive mess. Another nugget deep in this response is he's making 5 points here. In the fourth point, the first point was having a FRAND agreement so that they could license it. The second, they're worried about an unreasonably high licensing fee or royalty rate. Third, SawStop's successful lawsuit against Bosch was brought up. In other words, they're going to defend that patent should there not be any type of FRAND there. In the fourth one, it talks about Dr. Stephen Gass, who is the patent attorney who developed and patented the SawStop technology. In there, it quotes something very interesting. It says, we've tried to patent everything we could to prevent them from using it without a license from us. It says, for the past 20 years, SawStop has threatened table saw manufacturers with a 1-2 punch of a mandatory CPSC standardization, which is what we're trying to do here, or they're trying to do, and injunctive relief in district court or ITC action in order to extract supra-FRAND rates, higher than FRAND rates. And as former Chairman Burkle stated in 2017, thus far, that effort appears to have been successful, leaving SawStop as the sole provider of table saws employing AIM technology. This effort will continue to succeed absent a required FRAND commitment. Bosch's response to the commission is quite interesting. I found it fascinating to read through this. I'm not going to go over all of it. I'm going to give you the quick rundown. First, they basically laid out how long it took them to come up with the Bosch REAXX table saw that was basically sued out of existence, or sued from being sold in America by SawStop at the time. Now, it's interesting because they talk about how long it took them and how much money they invested into trying to come up with a technology that was different than SawStop's in a way, because SawStop, you touch the blade, trips through the circuitry, the brake hits the blade and drops it below the surface. REAXX was different in that there was nothing hitting the blade. It literally just dropped below the surface of the blade, and then you could reset your saw within 60 seconds and be back up and running. So theirs was slightly different, but a judge did find that Bosch violated some of the patents of SawStop, so they couldn't sell anymore. Then they entered into a confidential agreement that nobody knows what, but we don't see any Bosch saws with this AIM technology available in the US, so we can assume that's part of the agreement, was they couldn't sell it here. It even states in their letter, it says, although Bosch Power Tools designed and commercialized the REAXX table saw in 2016, due to the patent litigation discussed below, among other things, it has been more than 7 years since Bosch Power Tools has produced a table saw with AIM technology. So they're not even producing them anymore. And this is the fascinating part from Bosch. It says, if the CPSC were to move forward with mandating AIM technology on table saws in the US, which Bosch does not believe is necessary or warranted, that's an interesting point. Bosch Power Tools calculates it would take up to 6 years to design the original Bosch REAXX table saw and make it available in the US market. Why 6 years? Well, they're fixing to tell you. Well, first they would have to meet the current UL standard, which is numbered right there in front of you. But it also says that they would have to update, basically consider the environmental factors, including more powerful cellular signals, which affect the operation of their AIM technology. And it says that most of the components of the Bosch Power Tools AIM system will need to be redesigned or entirely redeveloped. So they would have to start all over developing. And you can imagine how much that would cost a company to go ahead and start developing this stuff when there's really no guarantee they won't get sued again, right? And then they go on to bring up the point that just because they put the technology in the corded saws, putting it in a cordless saw will also introduce more complexities and things they would have to overcome. In their response, Bosch discusses the litigation that happened on the REAXX table saw that prevented them from selling it. And they even go on to say that given the significant constraints, Bosch Power Tools, if other table saw manufacturers attempt to meet the new standard of the proposed CPSC table saw rule, they may experience similar intellectual property challenges that Bosch Power Tools did back when they released the REAXX saw in 2016. In other words, they're going to get sued if they don't license the proper technology or if the licenses aren't available and they try to develop their own to meet this new rule or proposed rule. Here's a nugget that they dropped in their response. Bosch is also concerned that the accident data used by the CPSC, which was, if I remember correctly, 30-something thousand or 50,000 people were injured by table saw accidents every year. Bosch is concerned that the accident data used by the CPSC to justify the need for table saw rulemaking is flawed in several ways. For example, it does not differentiate between the types of saws. Instead, the CPSC analysis combined accident data from cabinet saws, contractor saws, and benchtop saws. So maybe one is causing more injuries than the others. Who knows? We don't know. They just combined them all. Bosch also did their own little study on consumer choice. In other words, if you had the choice to purchase a saw with AIM or one without, which one would you choose? Well, they had a little data to back up their studies here. First off, only 5% of the respondents identified the flesh sensing technology as a top 3 priority on a table saw. Pretty interesting. And a majority of the respondents to this survey said they didn't want to pay over $800 for a table saw, because I think the majority, I don't have any data to back this up, but it's my personal opinion, that the majority of table saws purchased for use are for people like us, hobbyists and or side business type woodworkers or contractors, and you're buying the bench top and or contractor style table saws and less of the more higher end table saws that cost thousands of dollars. Then it says, during the time that the REAXX was available to be purchased, that 98.3% of customers chose a Bosch branded table saw that did not have the AIM technology in over the one that did. Here's where I think a lot of people are going to agree with Bosch. They state that they don't think that it's currently feasible, either technologically or economically, to use AIM technology on all table saws. And they believe that the current variety of table saw designs and sizes offered in today's market are reasonably safe and allow consumers to choose the table saw that best addresses the user's project and economic needs. I think that's where a lot of people are going to agree with Bosch. Now, Harbor Freight come back on the commission with their response, which is extremely interesting to me. First and foremost, it says the proposed rulemaking relies heavily on the fact that some key patents relating to the proposed requirements have expired or will expire soon. So if you saw my last video, that's one of the points that the CPSC brought up was that a lot of these patents were either already expired or would be expiring soon. That's not the whole story. Harbor Freight says in order to comply with the proposed rule, the additional safety features on a table saw will be required to have two essential elements: detection and mitigation. Detection is when you touch the blade, it detects that. And mitigation is removing the blade from the danger zone. In other words, dropping it below the surface, either by a brake like SawStop, or if you saw my Altendorf video where it just drops it below the surface. Harbor Freight brings up the same patent number that Stanley Black & Decker did that doesn't expire until April of 2033, and that has to do with the detection. In other words, when you touch the blade. They go into a little more detail on this patent because it says the 844 patent broadly claims a machine that could be any power tool having a circular blade and including an electronically triggerable actuator that generates a force that causes the blade to stop cutting the person within 10 milliseconds. This is going to be a very difficult patent to get around. Harbor Freight claims that this 844 patent is essential to meet the detection requirements of the proposed rulemaking. So they're saying that without this patent being freely available to them, literally they're not going to be able to comply, or they'll have to license it. And on the mitigation part, in other words, dropping it below the surface, they bring up patent US 8459157 or 157 patent. This patent deals with the brake and brake cartridges, which they say will not expire until July of 2030. So we're still looking at 6 years for this patent. Harbor Freight brings up the fact that there's only basically one company that has the know-how and experience to make this technology available, which would be SawStop. And they even state in here that SawStop and PTI members consider the programming of the sensing module to be a trade secret information and have not shared that information with any other table saw manufacturer and have not agreed to license that know-how, in quotes, to potential table saw competitors based on Harbor Freight's inquiries, which basically lists out where Grizzly and the others had tried to license this in the past. They go on to say that Harbor Freight doesn't have the know-how to implement this into their table saws either, and that they're going to also want a FRAN license in place so that they can put it on their saws in a fair and reasonable cost to them. Harbor Freight is now the second company to bring this issue up, which I think that they are right. It says, if the proposed rule is adopted as written, it will have unattended negative consequences for safety. Why? Well, here we go. First, it is likely that many existing table saw manufacturers will just exit the business and no longer offer table saws for sale because of the inability to meet the mandatory standard. What does that mean? Well, budget table saws gone. It's what Harbor Freight thinks will happen. It's probably some of theirs, if not all. They even say that even with a FRAN license, even if the FRAN license is available, both the patent technology and the implementation know-how, the price for a consumer table saw with the technology will increase at least $200 to $400, and that's the issue we talked about in the last video. This table saw that's now $300-ish, depending on the sale, goes from either $500 to $700, depending on what that license costs. That's a massive increase. Why does that matter? Well, according to Harbor Freight and a bunch of comments on the last video, unavailable and unaffordable table saws will likely cause consumers to turn to a less safe alternative than the current table saws on the market. Older table saws or circular saws modified by the consumer to operate like a table saw by flipping it upside down. Please don't do that. But that's what they're saying is going to happen. People are just going to DIY their own solutions, and it could be even worse than the situation we have now. Harbor Freight brings up something here that a lot of others have not, and that's the fact that, I'm going to summarize it, basically on SawStop's table saws, you can turn off that flesh sensing technology if you're cutting wet wood or aluminum or something like that. And they're saying basically that customers will be annoyed about having this on there either because of false trips or they don't want to buy extra cartridges. So they'll just bypass it altogether, and it was all for naught, right? And that's kind of what they're saying here. And another company here, Harbor Freight, bringing up the proposed rule would not only result in a monopoly for owners of applicable and unexpired patents, which they were talking about earlier, we all know who that is, as well as trade secret know-how. Basically, they're creating, if a monopoly were permitted, it is the American consumer who would be harmed by the lack of availability and affordable and safe table saws, and it can result in more injuries from this product. Grizzly comes in here, and you don't really hear a lot out of Grizzly. They kind of keep quiet and just make awesome stuff, right? They're not getting into a whole bunch, but they did here. They said basically to implement this type of technology, we're talking about AIM technology, table saw manufacturers must contend with existing patents held by 3 other companies. There's literally 3. Altendorf Group, which I showed their table saw, that thing is fantastic, but it's also multiple $1,000, like tens of thousands of dollars. It's not cheap. Felder Group, their table saw is also tens of thousands of dollars, and even the Felder Group, in response to the commission, originally said their technology costs $8,000 per saw. And of course, SawStop. they got the market cornered, okay? Because they have the technology that's affordably licensable, where the other ones don't at this point. Grizzly says right here, the technology is not something that can easily be designed around because of existing patents. So if they want to come up with their own technology, but because of the way the patents are currently, it's very difficult. I'm not gonna say impossible, but it is very difficult to design around current patents without getting sued out of existence or sued from selling those things. Grizzly brings up the economic side of this right off the bat in point number 2, economic cost to end users. They state that the affordability is an important issue to them. They have very affordable equipment. All of their equipment is really affordable. A lot of it's highly rated. So SawStop table saws are often more than double the cost of a Grizzly table saw. Their main argument is substantially increasing the cost of the table saws is a detriment to a diverse and healthy economy. In other words, you just take the budget saws out of it and then nobody else can, like, you're just out of luck. If you can't afford it, then that leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Is like, okay, well, you can't afford our technology, so we're gonna take our saw and go home. I mean, come on. Grizzly even states that they spent substantial resources researching how to work around these patents and parameters to come up with their own alternative. But they had to abandon those efforts because of increased costs to invent, which is not their business model. Their business model is to sell the machines, not to invent new technologies. I had a guy tell me one time, you're a woodworker, not a video editor. And I thought, he's right. I need to get a video editor because that's not my expertise. And that's what Grizzly is saying here. They're not inventors of new technology. They are manufacturers of equipment. And then Grizzly goes on to say that they would basically have to pass the cost on to their consumers, which they're not keen on, right? They don't want to increase the cost of their equipment to the consumer because it's just going to price a lot of people out of the hobby and or business. And back to the Altendorf costs, Grizzly talked to Altendorf about licensing their technology. They literally say that the cost of the Altendorf technology on a large panel saw exceeds the entire retail value of Grizzly table saws for our market segment. It's pointless to try to license that. Also, Altendorf is not willing to license their patents, according to Grizzly. When they talk to Felder Group, same thing. Regarding SawStop, Grizzly's efforts to license SawStop's patents have been unsuccessful. They wouldn't do it. Please review and close email correspondence 8/9 of 23. This is last year, y'all, in August. And this correspondence dated 6/7 of 2011. That's a few years back, right? Regarding SawStop's unwilling to license its technology. And in the last video, we talked about the timeline. They were talking about 3 to 6 months to implement this new technology on saws if the rule passes. Grizzly says not nearly enough time to make a working product. This will cause financial distress and burden on all the companies involved and in the industry that do not have such a patent. And then diversity or consumer choice comes into here too, because Grizzly finishes it up with, we would like to stress again that benchtop and stationary cabinet saws are safe when used correctly with the current modular style safety guards and riving knives installed. It says if a consumer wants additional protection, they can pay extra for the SawStop saw, a Felder Group product, or an Altendorf sliding panel saw. In other words, if the customer wants that technology, then they can just purchase the SawStop. Or if they don't, then they can just purchase any other manufacturer, including Grizzly. And here's the email. This is freely public information. This is the email from Grizzly. August 23rd, 2023, Grizzly sent an email to SawStop, aka Matt Howard, who is the CEO of TTS, if I'm not mistaken. Now, basically, they emailed and says that Grizzly is a SawStop dealer, and this year they've seen significant decrease in the amount of SawStops. But Grizzly table saws have not slumped. So then they inquire about the opportunity to license SawStop technology so that they can incorporate it into some of their table saw models. I think it will be mutually beneficial with very little lift on your end and pure profitability upside on the licensing fee. The response from SawStop is, quote, I also appreciate your inquiring regarding the licensing of SawStop technology for incorporation into Grizzly table saw. This is not a strategy we will pursue at this time. There are many reasons for this with roots in our company mission in the complexity of our technologies and its implementation, and in our long-term brand and go-to-market strategies. As of August, reading this email, it's not in their strategy to license the technology. But I thought the CPSC wanted people to license this technology. There's also a very interesting response here from the National Association of Manufacturers. We'll call them NAMs, N-A-M. Who they all represent, I'm not sure, but they're also not really in favor of this. They make a few points here. First, the voluntary standard is adequate, they claim, to reduce the risk of table saw injuries. In other words, the blade guard and the riving knife are part of that voluntary standard. In other words, we're already doing that, and we've seen decreases because of that, is their argument here. NAM also brings us some very interesting points here. It says the initial regulatory flexibility analysis, or IRFA, estimates the cost of manufacturers to attempt to redesign and retool for their saws would cost between $100,000 and $700,000 per model. So if they have 3-4 different models, you're looking at significant amounts of money to retool for these. NAM claims the proposal would essentially eliminate or ban cost-effective models from the market, significantly harming businesses that use the machines. Such a burden is not justifiable for small manufacturers or small contractor customers. The NAM respectfully encourages the Commission to readdress the cost and burden analysis in the proposed rule with a more tailored focus on small manufacturers. How many people are getting injured every year with table saws? Depending on what source you use, some say 65,000, some say 50,000. I'll give them the high side and say 65,000. That's a lot of people. How many people are in the United States? 331.9 million. Almost 332 million people are in the United States. Out of those, 50 to 65,000 are getting injured with table saws. What about ladders? How many people get injured on a ladder? It's estimated every year that 164,000 people are getting injured on ladders. That's a lot of people, y'all. Y'all be careful on them things. What about lawnmowers? 80,000 people get injured on lawnmowers. That's more than table saws. So if we're gonna mandate that all table saws blades stop, let's do it for lawnmowers. Their blades stop when it senses flesh. It's almost impossible, right? Because the grass is wet. I don't know. There's no clear answer here. Don't go crazy in the comments. Those examples don't make sense. I'm just telling you that multiple people get injured in multiple different ways around their homes, in their shops. Hammers do it. When you look at eye injuries in the U.S., I've Googled it. It says 700,000 Americans get injured at work. There's another stat that says half of all eye injuries in the U.S. are at home, yard work, things like that, chemicals. So you're looking at estimated 140 or 1.4 million people get injured, when all literally you have to do to prevent most of those is throw on some safety glasses. Very similar to table saws. Not saying that the AIM technology isn't important. I love it. I think it's great. But also using the table saw properly with proper technique and proper safety measures is also a massive thing. And I think what the Commission is missing here is an easier fix to reducing those table saw injuries. It's going to sound crazy to some of y'all. Put wood shop back in schools. When I was in school, there was a wood shop. We had safety classes on wood shop. There were power tools in the shop. We welded with metalworking tools. We did woodworking. Teach that stuff at a younger level, and then we're going to see a reduce in that. Because what happens is you get someone who's never been a woodworker before, never been around power tools before. They go and purchase a table saw at Home Depot, Lowe's, Harbor Freight, wherever. They don't really have an understanding of what's going to happen, the physics and everything with kickbacks, which isn't even addressed in the CPSC rules, which injure a whole bunch of people. Here's what's so fascinating to me, okay? I'm a huge fan of the SawStop table saw that I have and the technology that it prevents injuries. I love it. I think it's fantastic. Do I think it should be on every table saw? Yeah, if it's possible, it would be awesome. Do I think it should raise the cost of this saw $200, $400, $700? No. I don't think it should be forced on people. Here's where I'm a little confused. Maybe you can help me out. Grizzly asked SawStop in August of 23 if they could license their technology. SawStop denied it. So where are we at now if the Commission forces this regulation on us or on the manufacturers, which would roll down on us to buy them? Who are they going to license it from? Because SawStop, according to Grizzly's email that was submitted, they're not willing to license it. So are they going to be willing to license it if the rule passes? Because if I remember right, in the first video, they said they would consider it, but there was no clear answer. And that's the problem with this whole thing. This whole thing is the fact that there's no clear answers anywhere. So basically we're just spitballing stuff, throwing spaghetti on the wall and see if it'll stick, because the commission wants this to happen apparently, according to what I've read and researched and watched. They want to put this technology in the saw, but because there's patents that we know now last until 2033, 9 more years, I'm a little hesitant. In my first video, I was like, yeah, this is going to happen. But now that I know all the information, I'm not so sure. I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon without some major fights, because you can't license this technology if SawStop's not willing to license it. And if they own the patent, anybody that tries to put similar technology in there, if it violates the patent, of course, they're going to get sued in court to not be able to sell this technology. So it's a mess. It's such a mess, and it's fascinating to me at the same time, but I don't know where we go. I think it's just going to stay tied up forever, and we're just going to argue about it back and forth on who's right and who's wrong, and I don't know that it'll ever get fixed, honestly. Again, if they issue this rule that says, yeah, they all have to have it, then they're going to have to also issue that FRAND agreement so that everybody licenses it at a reasonable rate, because if you don't, then one company is going to jack the rates up and or charge whatever they want for the license, and it'll price a bunch of people out of business because they're not going to be able to produce those saws, which will roll downhill to the consumer who can't afford the higher end or the higher cost saws. So then they will figure out other methods other than a table saw, like the used market will explode. Older table saws will be more valuable, and then you have those that will DIY their own saws and things. I just don't know that this is a fixable problem at this point in time until these patents run out. What do you think? It's very difficult when you first start and you're on a severe budget like I was to afford a table saw, because those things are expensive, even at $300. That's a lot of money for a lot of people. And when you price it another $200 on top of that, like, that's groceries for people, y'all. Like, that's a lot of money. So if you're going to implement these safety rules, it should not be at the cost of the consumer having to pay substantially more. Then you argue the other side. Well, what's your fingers worth? Is your finger worth $200? Absolutely, it's worth $200. It's worth $1,000. It's worth $10,000. It's worth $1 million. Like, these digits are irreplaceable. They don't grow back. So yeah, it's worth the price, but it's just such a hard argument. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And in the meantime, go check out the first video. It fills you in on all the details of what the commission wants to do, how much it's going to cost, who's all behind this. There is the whole thing. Click that box, get you the big old virtual fist bump. Ooh, this is a tough one.